So for this week on CyberSchool, we're going to be going over our network switches. We make a lot of different products at CyberData, and personally, this is one of my preferred lines and one of my favorite lines of products that we have in terms of all the different products that we make. Anybody that's looked through our gigantic catalog of products, has probably just been impressed at the amount of hardware that we have and stuff that we make. And always, I get people that are usually pretty surprised at different trade shows about the different network switches that we make. And I really think these are really, really interesting products that we have to meet a specific use case and also to be a really good debugging or troubleshooting device that installers or, just different tech people like myself can use. I've got a background in computer science with networking. So this is always just something that I was really interested in when I saw these products. So we've got two different types of kind of smaller unmanaged network switches. We've got a USB powered variant as well as a PoE variant. And these come in both a standard option, where it just basically supplies two ports for network connectivity, as well as a mirroring option in both flavors, both USB and PoE. So they're really, really powerful units, and I wanted to spend today to kind of go over these products in more depth. So what do these products do? At a base level, these are two ports unmanaged switches. They can be powered either by PoE or USB. And optionally, if you opt for the traffic mirroring capability, they can mirror any traffic that's actually sent or received through a particular port to the host PC or the device that would basically be receiving that mirroring traffic. So it's a really great and easy way to be able to just see traffic from a particular switch port or devices. If you're trying to just kind of figure out what's going on as you're doing an install of different phones, or you're like somebody saying our support department as an example, or somebody in my position where taking direct logs from the unit are very, very helpful in either troubleshooting a case or initial testing on a particular phone system. Being able to capture the network traffic very easily is very, very powerful. And that's kind of what these switches do. They also supply that full gigabit speed capability. So that's one thing that you can lose with smaller unmanaged switches, say your 6-port switches or your 8-port switches, where they'll typically, sometimes, not as often as today, kind of gigabit speed is pretty much standard across the board in most switches that you can buy today. But in yesteryear, a lot of the times for the smaller switches, they would be regulated at 100 megabit per second instead of a gigabit or 1,000 bits per second. So it's much, much faster in terms of the actual traffic that can be sent. So that way you can just keep that traffic capability in there. And the main reason that we came up with these different switches is kind of when everybody started to switch over to VoIP in the corporate industry and kind of the late 2000s, early 2010s, where most businesses had Cat5 or Cat6 drops to each of the different workstations, so that way somebody could plug in their computer, just so that way they don't have to deal with the network Wi-Fi, potentially spotty connections. They can just be hardlined being on an Ethernet connection, so that way they've got that quick speed. And everybody also had just, regular Cat3 analog phone cables. But then everybody kind of started to switch over to VoIP phones, and for most VoIP phones, you need an Ethernet connection. So then that problem kind of came up where people needed to be able to, be able to plug in two devices. So there was kind of that hole there where people would either have to go out and spend, several $100 to buy a small little 6-port, unmanaged switch to be able to plug in just their phone and their computer, and they're sitting there with 4 extra ports. They're not really getting used. So there was that kind of hole in the network switch area. So that's kind of where we got the idea to, we'll just make a small little 2-port switch that you can plug into your Ethernet connection, and then you've got a port for your phone as well as a port for your computer. So at the end of the day, you can plug in all the devices that you would need to locally and not have any excess ports. You can just have just the right amount of ports for that connection. So that's kind of how we came up with this idea. And then it also just became very easy for us to drop in that mirroring capability, so that way you can do different network traces and be able to capture the traffic on a particular port. So that way you could easily see what's going on with a device, say, during initial install, or if you're a tester like some of us are. So why would you want to use some of these switches? So they use a standard Ethernet connection for to basically connect to any of the devices there, like your PC and your VoIP phone would. So you'll be able to connect two devices on that single backdrop back to your networking closet where they connect to a direct switch. And most of the time when you're dealing with especially VoIP phones, you're dealing with kilobytes of traffic when the thing is actually being used. So typically not much traffic is being used. So the PC or, the kind of main device that you have plugged in on that drop isn't going to be, say, restricted because it's fighting for bandwidth on that single drop with your VoIP phone. The phones really don't use that much traffic, especially when they're just sitting there idle. So you're not really going to be struggling for bandwidth. So it's totally fine to be able to share that one drop or that one main line back to the main switch between the two devices. And having both the USB or the PoE powered capability allows you to use the switches in any environment. I always like to opt for the USB powered variant just because it's easy to plug it into my PC because I've always got extra USB ports on my PC. But sometimes it's nice, if you don't have those extra ports or your PC is kind of, say, mounted underneath your desk and you don't really have that easy capability to run a USB cable over, you can do the PoE variant. Of course, assuming that the Ethernet drop that you have at your desk or your workstation location is an actual PoE port. Of course, we can't, take nothing and turn it into PoE. We have to take the PoE power, siphon off a little bit of power, and then send that back out to the VoIP device so that way it can actually get powered. So with those two capabilities, either PoE or USB power, it makes them really useful to drop into any environment. If you've got those extra USB ports, or if not, you've probably got the PoE power because that's what they were designating to use for your phone. I really, really love the port mirroring capability of it. It's been super helpful for me, especially when I'm trying to do a lot of different traces and stuff to actually test our products on different phone systems. It made it very, very easy to just start up Wireshark on my PC and capture all the traffic, say if I'm doing an hour's worth of testing. Whereas typically, if you didn't have that capability, you would either have to have a managed switch, which are definitely more expensive, and then you have to log into your switch and set up port mirroring, and there's a lot of steps that go into there. It's not too terribly complicated to set that up, especially if you've got kind of a background in adjusting managed switch settings. It's not terribly hard to set up, but not having to do that and just being able to plug in a device and plug in all your, plug everything into this one USB switch, then be able to just magically mirror all the traffic without having to change any settings, just makes it really, really easy and painless to be able to implement it. And I find it's really, really helpful to use these in areas where you're trying to do troubleshooting. This is one of the things that I always recommend, especially at some of the smaller trade shows that we go to where we're dealing with actual installers and resellers of our products, proper boots on the ground, people that are actually going and installing our speakers, installing our horns. I always really recommend that, if they actually do the setup and they're just not handling the installation, to consider getting one of our PoE switches. Because say if you're going through and you're installing all the different horns and you've got one horn or say one speaker that's being a little troublesome during installation, then you have to go and see if you can get in contact with the network admin at that particular location, say a school, to be able to log into their switch to set up that port mirror that we were just talking about. So that way you can see what traffic is going on with the speaker and whatever it's supposed to be registering with. Say that particular phone system, Informacast, or maybe even multicast if you're trying to set them up for a multicast environment. And that could be kind of painful, especially with now the trend that a lot of different schools and a lot of other bigger businesses are doing where they don't usually have a dedicated network administrator and they outsource it all. So then you have to get on the phone and talk to somebody so that way they can get you the privileges to get into the switch to just be able to port mirror and see what's going on. See that, you've got your password set in correctly and you're not able to register, or the device isn't even actually sending network traffic. It's able to connect, but it would really be very cumbersome in some scenarios to troubleshoot a particular switch. So if you get one of our PoE mirroring switches, you can just plug that directly in line. You basically just take that drop that was plugged into, say, your horn or your speaker, plug that into our switch, and then plug in your PC as well as that device you're trying to troubleshoot, and you'll immediately be able to mirror all that traffic. So one of our little PoE switches is an awesome unit to just have in your tool bag is you're going through an installation. So that way it takes all the guesswork out of having to, talk to the different administration people to be able to get access to the network and be able to get access to the particular switch so you can deal with the setup. You don't have to worry about all that. You just plug a couple cables in and you're able to mirror the traffic in moments. So it makes it a really, really powerful unit for troubleshooting and installation. And at the end of the day, these tiny little switches, while, they're not, say like 20, 30 bucks, they're usually, anywhere between $100 to $200, depending on if you buy them at MSRP, if you're buying them through distribution. They're, at the end of the day, a lot of the times they're cheaper than just doing a full another Cat 5 or Cat 6 run to that particular drop. It's always going to be more money to go and run a whole nother Ethernet line there. So it can be very advantageous to look for these different switches in certain scenarios. If you need that capability to plug in 2 different Ethernet devices, but you don't need a full switch at that location, our switches are a great option. So let's talk a little bit more about the USB variants in particular, part number 011236 and 011259 respectively. They use a standard USB connection to actually plug into the PC, and they use a single port for that uplink connection, of course, because they're going to have to be plugged into, basically the wall where that cat drop would be, which would lead back up to, say, the network switch that they're connecting to in certain scenarios. Could be a patch panel. They can basically connect up into other things. So you'll be taking one port of the 3 ports possible for that uplink connection, which leaves you 2 ports. And at that point, you can plug in either your PC and your phone, which would be our standard use case, or in, say, like our testing environments, like I've set up or our support department will set up, they'll actually plug in a switch to one of those ports. More relevant for the network variants of our switches, but it's definitely something you could do without the networking capability. But if they go for the mirroring version, it's going to send all of the traffic that's sent or received by one of the ports to the other port. And, like we've kind of been discussing at length, that makes it extremely helpful for debugging or troubleshooting. If you're not able to get something to register properly, you can run that trace and see that it's not able to, say, get an IP address or not able to get the proper DNS resolution from a particular server. So it makes it really, really easy to troubleshoot and is very powerful. For our PoE variant, they are basically the exact same idea, but you plug them into PoE instead of standard USB power. One of the nice things is they only take about 2 watts of power to actually go and run the switch. So they're very low power, very low intensity, and really shouldn't really restrict the capability of the endpoints that you'll be plugging in there. They do support jumbo packets. This is actually kind of a new thing that we've done, where if you're sending really large packets, upwards of 9,216 bytes, you can send them through our switches, which makes it really powerful for larger network transfers and just being able to send larger packets in general. So really, really powerful feature for our PoE switches. One of the ports is, of course, used for the uplink connection, and then 2 of the ports, just like the other switch, are going to be used for your endpoint connection, which could be your PC, that PoE phone that you need to be able to supply power to, or a switch in some occasions. And of course, the mirroring version, just like with our USB version, will take all of the traffic that's sent or received by a particular port and send that to the other port. So the one thing that I always recommend if people are interested in jumbo packet support, you got to go with our PoE line of switches currently. We are going to have support for the USB version down the line, but today the only version that supports the jumbo packets would be our standard PoE port, our PoE switches. So if jumbo packet transport is important to you, make sure to get those PoE variants. So let's talk a little bit more about plugging these things in, really how you go and install and use one of these things. Because I've been discussing at length, what these things do. Let's talk about how to actually implement one of these things. And I like this diagram that we have that's actually from the installation section of our 011187 PoE switch. And this is just our standard PoE splitter switch. It's not the actual mirroring variant of it, but this is a really good diagram, and it would be virtually the same if you're dealing with the mirroring version. So first we got to start with our uplink connection, and that'll be our green arrow. As you can see, the green arrow is at first pointing to the in port switch of the PoE splitter, and that other port plugs into the wall. because that's typically where you'll plug it into. It just goes into your typical wall outlet, you know, your typical Cat 5 drop that you'd have on your wall. Then you've got your 2 ports that you can plug into something else. They can be plugged into your PC or your VoIP phone, or really two other devices, both shown there in red and yellow for the 2 different versions, for the 2 different connection styles. But this just gives you a really good, easy way to understand how you would go and implement and actually install one of these different devices. Next, let's talk about one of these more complex ones and actually setting up a mirroring switch. And for this one, we'll be using our USB variant. So first and foremost, you want to plug in port number 1, labeled as port 1 on the switch itself, into your larger network. So in this instance, I've got it pictured with a Netgear switch there, but it kind of depends on your network infrastructure. Say if you've got just a really long cable that's coming from that network switch, or it might plug into the wall outlet like we saw on the last image. But it's basically just going to plug into your uplink. And port 1 is always going to be your uplink that goes back to, say, your switch, your router, and back out to the open internet. Port 2 is going to be what you're going to want to mirror, or the traffic that you're going to want to capture. And in the instance that I always ended up using this is I would plug port 2 into whatever switch that I want to particularly monitor. So I would just plug my switch into port 2, and then I can plug in as many devices as I want, of course, depending on the port configuration of that particular switch. Pictured here, I've got an 8-port, and that's what I have sitting here on my desk. And it's just kind of a standard PoE switch. That way you can plug in all your different network devices. And then all of the traffic that's sent on that switch and back out across that switch, say back out onto the rest of your network, say to a local phone server or to a hosted server, everything's going to pass through that mirroring switch and then finally get passed on to port number 3, which would be your PC that's also connected on there. So not only does your PC get connection back to the rest of the network, it can still, you know, browse the internet. It can, open Outlook, so that way you can check all your emails. It can even, you know, register with a phone system if you're using a soft client on there. It can get all of its own standard network traffic, but it can also receive all of the traffic that's sent or received through port number 2, that uplink for the switch. So that way you get all of the traffic from the devices that are directly plugged into the switch. And it makes it a really powerful, easy way to be able to troubleshoot and mirror traffic from multiple different devices. You can, of course, if you plug these in incorrectly, say if you plug in the network into port number 3, and basically if you switch ports 1 and 3, you plug in your PC to port 1 and you plug in the network into port 3, it's still going to allow all the devices to uplink and be able to send traffic back and forth, but all of the mirrored traffic will be sent back out to the network, and that'll cause a nice little packet storm and can shut down your network. We've definitely experienced that at our network. I did that one time and actually shut down our entire network for a couple minutes. That was a good laugh. That was a really fun thing to do as a greenhorn, as a newbie at CyberData. I got a good couple laughs out of that one. It's always better to learn, in small little quick environments like that, and not leave it running for a little while and cause a whole bunch of problems. So it's always just fun ways to learn. But definitely when you're plugging any of these in to actually be able to mirror traffic, you always want to be sure that you've got the port configuration set up correctly. Port number 1 is your uplink. Port number 2 is what you want to mirror, and port number 3 is where you want that mirrored traffic to go. So finally, in conclusion, let's talk about if these switches are right for your application. First and foremost, these are pretty economically priced switches. In comparison to other, larger switches, say if you're dealing with an 8-port switch or even a 16-port, if you need to plug a lot of things in on your desk, you're going to be dealing with, a couple $100 worth of equipment. And if you're not going to be using all of those different switches, you might want to look at something that's got a little bit more, a little bit less switch port capability. So that's where I think these devices really come in handy. If you're just dealing with, say, 2 ports that you need to plug something into, like our use case example where you plug in your PC and plug in your phone, these are absolutely perfect for that type of scenario. And the nice thing with these is they're really easy to set up and install. If you're just dealing with, say, the USB variant, you plug in a standard USB cable into your computer, you plug one into your switch, then you got power. You don't need to log in and deal with any tools to set anything up. All you got to do is literally just plug it in and then plug in all the devices that you want to be able to sit on the network. So it's really, really easy to just initially set up, especially with the PoE variant too. Then you don't even have to mess with the USB cable. All you got to do is run all your Ethernet cables and plug everything in. You know, if you can plug something in, you can use one of these switches. So I think they're really powerful in that aspect. And they're really versatile, depending on the type of environment that you're going into. You know, if you don't have that PoE capability, or say you've got phones that like the typical phone that I use for my testing, a Yealink T49G, has to have a standard AC wall adapter. So for me, I don't need that PoE capability to actually be supplied to my phone by my switch. I can just use the standard USB variant. However, if you're dealing with frankly more standard VoIP phones that are typically powered by USB, you need that kind of capability, or excuse me, powered by PoE, not USB. That'd be pretty cool. But if you've got that capability, if you've got that requirement, we've got a lot of different endpoints that can meet that need. If you need that PoE transport, we can provide that with the switch, or if you don't, we've got a unit to meet that capability. The real only downside to these particular switches are they're unmanaged. So if you're trying to do something really complex, like set up, one port on a different VLAN and a different subnet, and then a different port and a different VLAN and a different subnet, just to be able to capture all the traffic between those, our switches really aren't designed for that. And you really need more of a managed switch for that type of an instance. So that can be definitely a downside. If you need more capability out of your switch, say you need a particular PoE power limit that's supplied to one port and not the other, or you need to be able to set up a complex VLAN capability, our switches might not be right for that type of installation. But if you're just trying to split one Cat5 drop into two so that way you can plug in your computer and your phone, these switches are absolutely perfect. So one thing I've been liking to do at the end of all of our cyber schools is kind of go over an index of terms and stuff that we used in our discussion today. So first and foremost, we'll go over a switch. And a switch is just a standard network piece of hardware that can connect multiple different IP devices, Internet Protocol devices, together to actually create a network. If everything isn't plugged in together and can't talk to each other, you don't have a network. Then for IP. IP, or Internet Protocol, is just kind of an all-encompassing term for communications between computers. It's anything from standard SIP to, say, browsing, even a website or anything like that that's typically involved in the all-encompassing term of Internet Protocol. It's kind of just one of those big buzzwords that really means for anything that you basically do on a computer over the Internet. Next, we get to SIP, or Session Initialization Protocol. And we only briefly touched on this, but SIP is the protocol that's used to make calls between one point to a phone or to another phone. So it's widely used across the VoIP industry, almost predominantly if you're using a VoIP phone system, be it RingCentral, 3CX, Cisco Call Manager, what have you, they're likely using SIP. There are of course exceptions to that. Say, if you're using say like Skinny in the Cisco environment, which is the kind of proprietary version of SIP that they use, or H.263, which that would be used with Avaya phones. They've got their own kind of special proprietary protocol to be able to communicate. But predominantly, SIP is used when you're making phone calls from one device to another. PoE is just power over Ethernet, which is just another way to supply both power and network connection to IP devices. Cat5 or Cat6 cabling is just a particular category of cabling that's used with Ethernet connections. Ethernet is a way to connect computers on a network, pretty simple. It's just basically a way to plug things in. Port mirroring is to be able to send network traffic from one port to another port that typically requires actually logging into your switch to go and set up the process of that port mirror. But with our hardware, you can do that. Finally, USB, or Universal Serial Bus, which is just a standard way to be able to connect accessories to a PC. Think your mouse, your keyboard, in my case, my USB headset, my USB microphone, or, basically a lot of other devices. Pretty much everything that you plug into a PC, or heck, even your phone, is using some sort of the USB protocol.
Thank you for watching this edition of CyberSchool. If you have any questions, please get in contact with our sales department. They are available by email at sales@cyberdata.net or by phone at 831 373-2601 extension 334. Please make sure to like this video and subscribe for more content like this from CyberData.